In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this medieval watchtower out of XPS insulation foam. Everything begins with a digital blueprint that I create in Adobe Illustrator. The entire design process is done ahead of time, so I can focus purely on crafting. I'm starting with the bottom portion of the tower. For this, I'll need a bunch of bricks. I'm using a hot wire table to make all my cuts since it makes working with XPS foam much more efficient. You'll notice freshly cut bricks look unconvincingly like stone, since they're a bit too perfect. Fortunately, this can be solved by tossing them into a container of rocks and giving them a good shake. This takes the sharp edges off the bricks and makes them look much more stone-like. This process was repeated until I have enough bricks for the build. A tip for building structures is to stick a carpenter's square to your surface. This will help with alignment. The first row is stuck together by the sides, since there won't be any base for this build. Afterwards, all of the rows are glued by the bottom, making sure to stagger the bricks to create a strong structure. As you can see, I'm also playing with the alignment of the bricks to create an interesting texture. This process is actually a lot of fun as long as a few tips are kept in mind. Make sure your bricks are accurately cut. Any sort of difference will be compounded and will lead to rows not lining up. And choose a glue that's easy to use, such as PVA, wood glue, or tacky glue. A glue gun is overkill since the bricks are being stacked and gravity is working in our favor. After I finish stacking the bricks, it's time to get started on the top of the tower. I'm going to be cutting a bunch of 1 cm beams, making sure to hold on to the offcuts to be used as my flatter wood planks. A tip if you're using 1-inch foam, this size can perfectly cut down into 2 beams and 1 plank. Tinfoil is used to texture all the walls to make them look like stucco. I also texture the wood beams to make them look weathered. All wood is textured using a hot wire cutter with a wand attachment at a low temperature. This takes a while, especially for a larger build, but it creates a texture that looks great and is worth the time investment in my opinion. The beams are then cut to size and glued to the floor. Every so often I dry fit the pieces to make sure there's no mistakes prior to gluing. In this part, I'll be creating the 4 sections that make up the first floor of the tower. I bring back the carpenter's square to help with the alignment. Afterwards, these sections are glued to the larger floor piece. I'm giving all these walls wood texture using the same technique shown earlier. I'm also cutting them to create separate planks. Since the planks are separated, I'm also able to cut the edge of them and make them look even more like wood. The planks are then glued together. Here I'm printing out a piece of my blueprint to help with the window placement. Once the glue is somewhat dried, I start to make the cuts. The wood planks I made earlier are then used to add detail to these windows. Once the glue is dried, any excess is then trimmed off. Beams are then glued to the sides of each of the walls. The walls are then glued to the bottom floor. Along with smaller side panels and the larger beams. This process is repeated until all 4 sections of this bottom floor are complete. I continue the first floor by adding some beams to the top of the walls. Tinfoil is great for making foam ends look like rough wood. After gluing the rest of the beams down, the first floor walls are now done. Time to move on to the second story. I start with cutting out the walls and afterwards cut out the space for my window. These windows were 3D printed, which is a great way of adding finer detail to a scratch build like this. Next, I place some planks to give the wall a timber frame look and strategically cover up the window gaps. I texture 4 wooden beams, 1 for each of the corners. I then glue all the walls together. Here I'm cutting out a couple of gables, the triangular portion that covers the pitched roof. These are then glued down in place. I then cut out and texture a few larger planks for the roof. These are cut on an angle to create a more interesting shape. I like to exaggerate the space between the planks to give it a more wooden look. I finish up the roof with a larger beam on top. The second story structure is then glued onto the first by the larger beams. Once the 2 stories are attached, I finish the roof off on the first floor using similar techniques as a second story roof. It was at this point that I realized I forgot to add a floor to the second story, so I carefully slipped one in before the structure was sealed forever. The top portion of the tower is almost done, just need to add some shingles to make these roofs pop. I create my shingles by texturing one side of a chunk of foam. This is going to be the bottom edge of each of the shingles. The goal here is to create an uneven, interesting edge. I then swap out the foam cutter head to a wand attachment and start texturing the side of this chunk. This is going to be the top of the shingles. I set the hot wire table to a thin setting and cut this textured edge off from the chunk. I repeat this step until I have enough shingle strips to cover the full build. These strips are then stacked to save time and cut out to create individual pieces. The shingles are then glued onto the roof one by one, starting from the bottom so that the row above is overlapping. You'll notice that I'm leaving some shingles missing. I do this to create some dimension and extra visual interest. This process is pretty tedious, but it's worth it in the end, in my opinion. Here you can see a time lapse of me shingling one side of the roof. Similar to the windows, I 3D print a couple of doors for the bottom of the tower and finish them off with a wooden trim. At this point, the building portion is done and it's time to get some paint on this tower. As always, I base coat the entire build in black paint. I water this down so that it doesn't obscure any details and flows easier into the cracks and crevices. After the base coat is dry, I start on the lower stone section. Using 3 paints, I establish a palette ahead of time from darkest to lightest. I'm painting each brick one by one from darkest to lightest, bottom to top. This creates a gradient of hues. I'm applying the paint with an overbrush method. This means that there's enough paint to cover the brick, but not enough to cover the deepest recesses. I'm using the lighter colors in my palette to edge highlight the bricks below and tie together the colors. I add a few lighter bricks to the bottom of the tower to break up the gradient and give the overall stone texture a more interesting look. I then finish up the bricks with one last edge highlight to make all the bricks pop. Here you can see the benefit of varying the depth of the bricks since the edges can really be picked out. The stucco is going to be painted in this off-white color. It's important to paint the deepest sections of the build first, since any spillover can be fixed with subsequent layers. Next, I'm going to base coat the wood with a dark brown. At this stage, I'm also cleaning up any beige paint from the stucco stage. After the dark brown is applied, I then highlight it with a lighter brown, this time applying it with a dry brush method. The wood is then dry brushed one more time with an even lighter brown, focusing on mostly the edges. The shingles are going to be painted in a dark navy. Shout out to World of Warcraft. All the years playing that game in the past has taught me that fantasy roofs must be colorful. At this point, I'm also cleaning up any spillover from the wood stage. I build up the blue with lighter colors to make the shingles pop. Next, I create my own weathering pigment by shaving down a soft pastel. I prefer this method to adding depth to a build since it allows for a lot of control. It's finally time to attach the top of the build to the bottom. On to my favorite part, time to add some moss to this tower. This is created with a simple combination of PVA glue and flock. I apply this anywhere that moisture tends to build up, but mainly where I think it'd look cool. This ties together the entire build and also adds some contrast, both in texture and color. This tower was built at 32mm scale, so it's perfect for tabletop wargames and RPGs, including Warhammer or Dungeons & Dragons. Alright everyone, that wraps up this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit the like button below and subscribe for future hobby content. Also, let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see next. I'm always open to suggestions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.